So hi everyone, this is Mary Kurek with Frontrunners Innovate magazine, and I have with me today Antwain Thomas, who is he's the founding and managing partner of Global Wealth Strategies, headquartered in the DC area of the United States. And so what I wanted Antwain to bring to the surface with you guys today is some information about data privacy, because Antwain, while his tentacles go deep into lots of different areas, is proficient in wealth management, strategy around fintech, privacy of data, that kind of thing. And so we wanted him to share a little bit of information about what they do in that space to protect people's data. And Antwain, I'm going to let you share a little bit more about your background, and then we can go forward with a conversation around data privacy. Okay, doke?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay, go ahead.
So my background, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. My background stems in the military and critical infrastructure. So I'm quite sufficient in understanding how data travels through our telephone networks. I was originally a telecom engineer back in the late 80s, early 90s. So, everything that kind of happens in our technology space flows through our telecommunications systems. So in the military, I was responsible for managing our critical infrastructure, protecting our data between the fleet at sea, as well as communication infrastructure at our military bases. So when you're looking at a defense network, our protection mechanisms are based on very solid fundamentals, right? The internet, although everyone uses it, there are different pathways and roadmaps that get you to the same place. No different than a freeway, right? You have a freeway that can get you to multiple places, but those routes will get you to the same place. It just depends on how you want to actually get there based on congestion and things of that nature. So where we are today with the financial sector, as well as other industries, manufacturing, the supply chain, everything is pretty much managed by digital assets somewhere. So what I've done over the years as a government contractor, independent government contractor, and providing consultation as a wealth manager, as well as a technologist, I utilize the same tools that I've actually, utilized from many years ago. So the fundamentals of cryptography, how do you secure confidentiality? That becomes a very important aspect, because confidentiality is something that I think a lot of people overlook, because the information that we load onto a social media platform, people will sometimes say, well, I'm not trying to hide anything. And I hear that a lot from a lot of people. I'm like, why should I have to protect my information? Why should I have to, protect my information if I'm not trying to hide anything? But that goes down to confidentiality and integrity of the data. So it's not so much of you trying to hide information from someone. It's about mitigating the risk, because it is the Wild West on the internet. You can secure your connection. There are many ways to actually protect your privacy and data, but privacy and security, they are odd bedfellows, although they are similar. But protecting how your data is actually manipulated and who's managing your data, as well as who owns your data. And that becomes a kind of a departing reality, because although we believe we may own the data, because owner creator of the data typically means that you own your data, such as call records. Call records technically on your cell phone are your records, but if you call a cell phone a provider and you want to get access to your information, they'll ask you a whole bunch of questions about who you are. But I've been told when I've made a phone call, just to kind of do a social engineering type of conversation, I was told one time that, sir, I can't tell you anything about your information. You'd have to log on and access it yourself. So there's kind of a conflict of who is the owner, creator of data, and who actually truly manages that data. No different than health records, no different than just Social Security records, because technically your Social Security number is a contract with the government, although it is your number and you use that number for a variety of services. There's still a confusion of conflict of interest on where does the ownership chain start of ownership of the data, and where does the end of life end for that data. And I think that's where things become, kind of gray, especially with, when hacks and attacks happen, at an institutional level, at a sovereign level, whether it's government to government, because we also have government attacking governments, but that's the nature of collecting information and sharing information. So right now there's a bill going through Congress to identify whether or not the government is following correct disclosure guidelines on how information is being disclosed, so that they can attach that to an order, an executive order, or what is permissible to bypass due process to access someone's information, where that gets gray too, because with Homeland Security, with the Patriot Act, there are certain nuances to how information is accessed based on the need to know, and of course the national security umbrella, which a lot of times can be obfuscated and pushed to the side for the sake of national security. And we learned that from the case of Apple. If you remember a few years back, the federal government wanted Apple to actually open up a phone, which this phone supposedly and allegedly was actually connected to a suspect that was committing and conducting terrorist activity on his phone. But here what becomes the issue and situation. So Tim Cook offered the DOJ that he could provide a snapshot of what's on the phone through a secure, compartmentalized process. That's approved by the government, by the way. It's a government process of disclosing confidential information, because even though it is a potential terrorist activity that might be going on the phone, there's an issue of Apple opening up their intellectual property, because once they do that and they give the key to how Apple actually stores and encrypts information, then that might set a precedent for the government, overusing their authority or misusing their authority. When something like that happens next, then they could just go into Apple's, source code and actually bypass their policies and procedures. So, but the funny thing at the end of the day, once Apple said we weren't going to do that, the government says, oh, well, we found another way to go about it, so it won't be necessary. So the FBI and everyone went through that whole entire, performance just to exercise the industry
money.
On, well,
spend the money.
Exactly. It comes down always to follow the money, right? So these are lessons that, I've learned, that the community and the cyber community has learned, that, nothing is as what it seems. And even though something is supposedly secure, there is not a silver bullet to protect any one resource, but we do something called defense in depth protection, which is a multi-layered structure where if one or two layers fail, then there's 4 or 5 layers to pick up. And you see this type of security apparatus in banks. So like when you go to a bank, you see a security camera, you see a security guard, you see the tellers, you see, different, gobos that divide lanes of customers when they come in. So these are all techniques. These are physical techniques, not so much digital techniques, but that's where we get our digital security techniques from. It's from the physical world. So a police officer or a guard, he's looking and surveilling the perimeter around the building and inside the building, right? You have doors that can lock and unlock. That's another way to prevent access to the building if there is someone that's trying to break in. There's also the cyber aspect of breaking into a bank, where the physicality of the bank doesn't matter, because as long as someone understands the actual nuances of how a bank is postured, then the camera is not really going to help a cyber attack. A security guard, unless he's, in the industry, but his role is not to, monitor the technology to see what's going on the backbone of the system. So these are different layers where if the security camera goes offline, if someone comes in and incapacitates the security guard, what happens after the police officer and the security camera goes down? Where there's other countermeasures that banks have in place that will either secretly record something that's not as visible as a visible security camera. There are various different guidelines that banks have now taken. Of course, now insurance companies are now coming into the fold, because as a publicly traded company or someone that holds and controls data, if someone attacks a infrastructure or a network like Bank of America or Merrill Lynch, will all have been hacked in recent past, they're not going to hold these institutions liable, because without disclosing this information, it doesn't give the public an opportunity to answer what information has been violated and what information has been stolen. And even the government itself has fallen short on proper disclosure and timely disclosure of a cyber attack. So there are tools that can be used. There's several tools that I use to protect my communication. All my devices, for the most part, have transparent encryption. So it doesn't require someone to have cryptography knowledge to actually use it. It's seamless. So pretty much any data that's stored on an SSD drive or USB drive, the hard drive itself is encrypted. So any information that's loaded onto the drive, it has to go through a certain process. So if someone tries to copy the data without permission, then the data will be copied, but the contents will be unreadable. Right. So it's a matter of protecting confidentiality, integrity of the data, and availability of the data. So in the security world, we call this the CIA triangle: C for confidentiality, I for integrity, and A for availability. So the whole idea is the information should be held confidential, so it should be protected in whatever way it can be, whether you're encrypting it, you're shielding it, or you're ghosting the information. So you can actually have information on a computer that actually is physically on the hard drive, but not physically visible to the wrong authentication. So if you don't know the authentication process, you won't see it, because it'll be a ghosted kind of, steganography, where you're hiding the data with inside data, right? So the data is physically present on a computer, but it's physically not accessible or visible unless you have the proper credentials to unveil the secret data that's on that drive. Integrity is
so sophisticated now with processes that we having to keep up with the people who are trying to hack us, I think. But,
and that actually happened over time, right? Because you're not going to put a protection scheme in place unless there's a reason to do that. And I think that's a catch-22, right? Because back in the 80s, there was a huge attack on the internet infrastructure in the mid-80s. It was called the Morris worm. And Robert Morris Jr. was the son of an NSA architect, Robert Morris Sr. So both of them, obviously Mr. Morris, he was one of the top architects for the NSA. He actually designed most of what the NSA has in its toolbox today for surveillance and spy operations. But what his son did, his son was going to a university, I forget which one, I think it was either MIT or Stanford, and he was experimenting with how vulnerable are routers on the internet. So he didn't do this on purpose, that's the story, but what happened is he inserted a line of code. It was a worm. It was supposed to be self-contained in the network at the university. But as you and I know, universities were one of the first test beds for when the DoD converted the ARPANET, the defense side of the internet, and commercialized the internet. So he actually put it on a router that was connected between that university and all the other routers that connected the internet to itself. So the worm actually started to shut down inundate Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, every telecommunication provider in the world started seeing red on their screen saying that there's a systemic failure of every router around the world. So he was investigated by the FBI. The NSA called him in because he was the son of their senior architect. So you could imagine the Morris worm, although was supposedly not a big deal to his son. It was a big deal to every system connected to the internet, because that worm kind of collapsed pretty much every major artery of the internet. Now, of course, the internet's designed to come back. It has redundancy systems in place, so that's how it was designed from the designers that designed the internet. But that just goes to show it's one of the greatest examples that even though in the 80s there weren't really too many people hacking like they are today, it just showed how vulnerable the internet really is, because the internet was not designed to be a secure system, because there was no need to design it that way, because it was designed to be an open, transparent system where people could openly share information and data. That was the whole point of the internet when it was first created, when the government came to Stanford to have their team design a way to have two computers communicate over a telephone line. That was never done before. But of course, if you connect a computer to a telephone line, there's all sorts of things that could potentially happen, but then people learn about vulnerabilities. Then when someone learns about a vulnerability, they exploit the vulnerability. So over time, that vulnerability turns into a market, right? So there's a black market on exploiting vulnerabilities, and there's actually on the dark web, people actually sell those vulnerabilities to third parties, including third-party governments that, of course, they, there's a lot of elements to that.
Yeah,
there's a lot
we do.
Yeah.
Antwain, this is fascinating. This is I loved all the stories that you're sharing, because it brings it to life for everybody. And we could do a whole nother segment on this alone, but I so appreciate the information. And, it really does show where we're going, kind of like the history of where we've been and where we're headed with all of this. And, I feel better knowing that there's somebody like you who's kind of looking at the big picture in terms of privacy of data, not just in your space, which is typically wealth management, but you and I both know you do so much else, so many other things in your work, and you do it globally. So it's really great to know that people who have that ethical background and that mindset about privacy exist in the really tight-knit places where breaches can occur. And so we want to make sure that everybody has the right data. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Antwain. Take care. We'll be checking back in again. Thanks.
All right.